Well, welcome everybody to the Almond Board of California's Training Tuesday Part 6, Exporting to the European Market Aflatoxin and the Pre-Export Check Program. Today's webinar will run from 8 a.m. to 9:15 a.m. We will be hearing from ABC's Director of Quality Assurances and Industry Services, Tim Birmingham, and Senior Manager of Marketing Order Services, Bryce Speicher. Before we get to the content, a little housekeeping. Only the presenters today will be able to unmute themselves or turn on their camera during the presentations. However, we will have a Q&A session at the end of today's webinar. If you have questions, you are encouraged to use the chat feature, which you can see up at the top of your screen in between the people and reactions icon. When you click that button, you will get a queue at the bottom right hand of your screen where you can type in your question. We encourage you to type in your question, and I will be monitoring and reading the questions at the end so Tim and Bryce can answer accordingly. You can also raise your hand at the end if you'd like to ask a question. You can do that by clicking the Reactions tab right next to the chat tab at the top of the screen. And you can raise your hand and during the Q&A portion of today's webinar, and I will request you to unmute yourself. Again, we encourage you to use the chat feature, which seems to be the smoothest way to ask a question. With all that being said, I will now hand it over to Tim Birmingham of ABC. Tim, I'm going to stop sharing, and now you can share your screen.
All righty. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for that introduction, Taylor, and hopefully you all can see this screen that's up here right now. My name's Tim Birmingham. I'm Director of Quality Assurances and Industry Services, as Taylor mentioned. And my colleague here, Bryce Speicher, he's our Senior Manager of Marketing Order Services. And yes, I'm in the office today, as some of you probably realized by the train horn that's going off behind me right now. It'll be through here in a second, so I apologize for that. What we wanted to cover off on today, sorry, let me put my camera on too. I realized I didn't have that on here, so hopefully you all can see me as well. Really what we wanted to cover off on today is a little bit of an industry overview, just to kind of ground ourselves in the size and scope of the almond industry. Then we want to understand aflatoxin a little bit. We want to look at, what are the sources of aflatoxin, where does it come from, but more importantly, how do we control aflatoxin? And then really we're going to dive into our pre-export check program for aflatoxin, and we're going to talk about where some of the variability is associated with aflatoxin, how sampling impacts that, and Bryce is going to dive into some of the details on the pre-export check program, the program that we have here for testing product before it's shipped to the EU to make sure that we're sending product that has low levels of aflatoxin. All right, so let's keep moving along here. Bear with me just a second here. All right, so the California almond statistics, so just a little overview of the size and the scope of the industry. So the acreage report came out last week. So we're at 1.6 million acres. Of that, 1.32 are bearing acres. The last crop, so this last crop we harvested, the 21-22 crop, coming in at right about 2.9 billion pounds. This is down from last year, about 6%. So a little bit lighter than we were last year at this point. We have 7,600 growers and 101 almond handlers. And the majority of these growers are multi-generational. We have a lot of family farms that are represented in the California almond industry. And the farm gate value is $5.62 billion. These are figures from 2022 on the farm gate dollar value. California provides 100% of the U.S. production of almonds. We export 69%. And 31% of the product remains here in the United States. And it is a top California ag export. And 4 of the top 10 export destinations in 2021, 2020 and 2021 are indeed Europe. And that's really important because of the pre-export check program, the controls in Europe for aflatoxin. That's why we have a program. The pre-export check program is to make sure that we're meeting the limits that are established in the EU for aflatoxin. On the top right here, you can see the top global destinations And the top 10 export markets are represented by 70% of total export shipments. And then the 2021-22, the year-to-date exports, you can see we're at about 35% for Western Europe, 2% for Eastern Europe, 44% for Asia Pacific, 15% for Middle East and Africa, and then you can see the North American market as well. All right. So understanding a little bit about aflatoxin. So there are a number of Aspergillus species, fungi that are present in the environment. Aspergillus flavus and Aspergillus parasiticus. These are the two that are commonly found in almond orchards. And given the right conditions in a host, they can grow and produce the aflatoxin, which is a chemical compound. It's a secondary metabolite. It's produced by the growing fungi. And it is a potent carcinogen. It's widely regulated given its prevalence in crops around the world, and it's measured in parts per billion. And so just to kind of put this into context, a part per billion would be equivalent to a drop in an Olympic-sized swimming pool or a pinch of salt in a 10-ton bag of potato chips. So we're talking about an extremely small amount, and that creates some challenges, particularly when you're talking about sampling for aflatoxin in a crop that doesn't have high levels of aflatoxin, or in which the aflatoxin may not be homogeneously distributed. And we'll get into that here in a little bit more detail. Really, where do we focus as the Almond Board? We've spent a lot of effort over the years on prevention and control. We want to understand, where does it come from? How can we control or reduce it at the orchard level? And what are those proper practices to make sure that we're not introducing, mold growth and aflatoxin development during storage and transportation, distribution? We spent a lot of effort on how do we deal with it if it's there on the product. So removal and mitigation. So some of those post-harvest strategies that are used to not only detect, but to get the aflatoxin out of that product stream. And so we'll spend some time here talking about that as well. And then finally, the sampling and the screening prior to shipping. So you do all of these things to make sure you have the highest quality, the safest product, to reduce the potential risk for aflatoxin in the product. And then you have some checks at the final point before you ship that product to make sure that it's meeting the regulatory limits of the country that you're shipping that product into. And so we have our pre-export check program for the European market. Again, very important market for us. That program where we test almost every single consignment here prior to shipping to the EU to make sure that it meets the EU regulatory limit. So when we talk about aflatoxin and where do we find it, we've done work over the years that really shows that there's a high level of correlation of aflatoxin with insect damage. And so, there's a number of reasons for this, but the what you see here is a little navel orangeworm. It can actually create microclimates on the nuts that allow conditions for the mold to grow. If you look closely on this photo, you can also see those little spheres or mold spores. So this worm can actually transport this to different nuts, growing nuts on the tree, and it can spread it around throughout the orchard when it actually starts to fly as well. We have a lot of work that's focused on removal of navel orangeworm. You don't want to allow extra flights of navel orangeworm. If you have mummy nuts in the orchard during the winter, you want to remove those so that you don't have those extra flights in early spring of navel orangeworm. But there's a lot of reasons why insects are associated with it. In this study, we've done some studies to show that. What you see here on this slide is that we looked at 50 different lots of product, and we've sorted them out into these different grade categories. So we've come up with grade categories of high quality, mechanical damage. So that would be your chipped and scratched nuts, your insect damage, your other defects like gummy or shrivel. We looked at nuts, dividing them into categories where we can actually see mold. And you can see the different fractions there. So our high quality nuts in these studies contributed to about 83.7% of the weight of the nuts that were analyzed. And of that, 3.2% of the aflatoxin was associated with high quality nuts. So 83% of the mass was high quality, but only 3.2% of the aflatoxin mass was associated with high quality. Mechanical damage. So this is a chip and scratch. Again, that constituted 7.4% of the mass, and actually contributed a higher amount of aflatoxin. So as you start to get into the damaged nuts, you're going to find more aflatoxin as well. So we saw almost 8% of the aflatoxin mass from these studies were associated with mechanically damaged nuts. And then you look at the insect damage. So again, this was lower quality product, so we had a higher insect damage to begin with. 7.2% of the mass was identified as insect damage, but that contributed to 76.3% of the overall aflatoxin mass in these 50 different lots. So right here, this is showing us very clearly that correlation between insect damage and aflatoxin concentration or aflatoxin mass. And then you do see, aflatoxin in some of the other lower quality nuts as well, such as the gummy and shrivel. We had only 1.5% of the aflatoxin mass, but that contributed to nearly 12%. I'm sorry, 1.5% of the weight of the nuts, and it contributed to roughly 12% of the aflatoxin mass. And then the moldy nuts, these actually, are very, very few as far as the percentage of the weight, and actually not that high of a level of aflatoxin. But this slide, clearly shows that the insect damage and mechanically damage, and the defect nuts are where you're typically going to find the aflatoxin if it's there. Now, it doesn't always mean that if you have higher insect damage or lower quality, more chip and scratch, you're always going to have aflatoxin. It's not a direct correlation. But when you do find aflatoxin, you typically do find it in the lower quality fractions of the lot. So some other work that we've done is really, okay, what do you do if you have aflatoxin in a lot, or what can you do to mitigate the potential for aflatoxin? How can you remove it if it's there? So we've done some sorting studies where we've looked at different levels of aflatoxin in a lot. This is an example of one of these studies where the input level of aflatoxin was almost 3 part per billion, the 2.9 part per billion. We ran that through a laser sorter. We collected the reject stream, which constituted about 3.1% of the weight. And you could see in that fraction, we were able to concentrate aflatoxin to almost 30 part per billion. So again, this shows that correlation between that reject or the lower quality nuts and aflatoxin. But it also shows that you can actually start to remove that from a given lot of product. Coming out of the laser sorter, we actually decreased the level of aflatoxin. So we started at 2.9 part per billion. Coming out, we reduced it to 2.1 part per billion. And again, we concentrated the reject stream at about 30 part per billion. Then we subjected it to additional sorting. We ran it across a hand sorting line where you're actually physically removing more of the rejects. And that stream constituted about 1.9% of the overall weight of the product. And we were able to show in that stream, again, another concentration to 40.3 part per billion of aflatoxin. And coming out of the hand sorter, we actually showed a reduction to 1.5 part per billion. So on the input side, almost 3 part per billion. Through these different sorting mechanisms, we were able to remove aflatoxin from the product stream and reduce it to the final level of 1.5 part per billion in the finished lot. On the right-hand side here, you can also see that blanching is also very effective at removing aflatoxin. There's kind of a physical action that's happening with blanching. We're actually physically removing the aflatoxin by removing the skins, but there's also some denaturization that's occurring as well. There's some studies that have been done to show that and different combinations of time and temperature of blanching have a different effect on reducing the levels of aflatoxin. But suffice it to say, it is very effective at lowering the levels of aflatoxin. All right. So one of the things that we pay a lot of attention to, and you've probably seen this for those of you who are growers or huller shellers or on the handling side, is we have a lot of guidelines around management of moisture for the almonds, and that's for quality purposes, but it's also for maintaining the safety of the almonds. We don't want to allow moisture to increase to levels that can influence the moisture of the nut, and then allow the mold to grow and the aflatoxin to develop. Now, we know from studies that there is a certain amount of moisture that is required, or certain water activity that's required for both mold growth and aflatoxin development. And so we know that you won't have any aflatoxin mold growth, any aflatoxigenic mold growth or toxin production if you can control some of these things. So, really what we're looking for, the water activity and the temperature. At marginal temperatures, so 10 degrees Celsius, 50 degrees Fahrenheit, to 43 degrees Celsius, so it's 109 Fahrenheit. That's kind of an area that you want to pay attention to. But if you control the water activity, if you're less than 0.80 or 0.82, you really don't have an issue. So moisture is really important. What you see here on the right on this chart here, this is an isotherm graph, and it really correlates the water activity of the relative humidity on the bottom axis, and on the left axis you've got almond moisture percent. And so we can see if we're targeting a less than 0.80 water activity, really we need an almond moisture that's going to be less than 8%. Well, all of our guidelines call for almonds to be well below that percent, and actually when they come in from harvest, they're typically below 5%. So they're already very stable. They're already at conditions that will not allow the growth of mold if they're stored properly. It's very important to make sure that you don't create little micro conditions in how they're stored that could actually push these numbers up and actually lead to increased levels of moisture. Stockpiling is really important, and that's why we spend a lot of time with stockpile management, because if you have condensation that's forming on stockpiles, you could increase the mold that could allow you could increase the water activity, could allow the mold to grow and the aflatoxin to develop. So, as I just mentioned, almond moisture, is very, very key. That's the key throughout shelf life, is to maintain that moisture. We've got the stockpile guidelines that really are focused around safe conditions so that you don't have issues with mold. We recommend that you do not stockpile if the hull moisture is going to exceed 13% or the kernel moisture exceeds 6%. Again, 6% kernel moisture, it's not enough to really allow mold growth and aflatoxin development. But remember, in these stockpiles with tarps on these stockpiles, you can have condensation that actually starts to develop, particularly when you have temperature fluctuations from morning to night. So it's important to make sure you're really looking at this closely. With stockpiles also, it's why we have management practices such as ventilation of the stockpiles, and orientation of the stockpiles. All of this is really focused to minimize the potential for condensation, which then could create hot pockets, which would allow mold to start to grow and potentially aflatoxin. Almond kernel moisture, again, less than 8%. It's going to prevent the growth of pathogenic microorganisms. It's also going to prevent the growth of the mold and the subsequent development of the aflatoxin. Proper humidity during storage, and I would say storage and transportation is really key. The almonds are like a sponge. They will start to take up humidity, moisture from the environment, but it takes a long time. So that's the good thing. And I've got some studies here I'm going to show you some data on from the transit studies that show that even if exposed to abuse conditions, they really don't rise to the level of concern during transport. But if you're storing almonds in a stockpile for many, many months, they will slowly start to take on moisture from the environment, or like I just said, you have condensate, they'll start to pull that into the almond, and then you can run into some issues. So it's really important to manage that moisture. So speaking of the transit studies, so we've done a number of studies over the years, really looking at different locations and different times of the year to gather data that really shows what are we dealing with from a moisture and a temperature standpoint during shipping. We want to see if conditions possibly exist where there could be potential issues with mold growth or aflatoxin development. This is a question that does come up from time to time with the different regulatory agencies, both in Europe and Japan. We talk about the programs that we have here domestically for testing product before it ships. The question that is oftentimes raised is what happens during transit? How can you be assured that we don't have mold growth and aflatoxin development during transit? And so we've done a number of these studies over the years to try to answer those questions. Starting back in 2011, we did some studies looking at shipment to Rotterdam, and then more recently we've looked at repeating that study in 2018. We've also looked at in this last year, we shipped product to Italy, and then we've looked at a couple of consignments that have actually gone to Japan here recently. I have data from one of those that I'm going to show you as well. And so what we do with these transit studies, really, we have these little data loggers here. You can see this orange data logger, and we're capturing temperature and humidity. We put these in different locations within the containers. We put them in boxes on pallets at different locations, and then we place the pallets on different locations within the container. The one thing that is kind of the missing piece that we don't have a clear idea on is actually where the container is placed on the ship. That's why gathering a lot of data, we think that we have a good understanding of kind of what the landscape is, but we don't know for sure where these containers are placed on the ship. So here's one of the early ones that we did. This study right here was shipping product from Oakland to Rotterdam. This was from May to July in 2011. And what you can see is this top graph represents temperature. The bottom graph represents humidity. What you can see is these red bars on the beginning, so A and B, reflect really when that product is loaded and then when it's kind of sitting there ready to get on the ship. So this has been delivered to the port, but it's not yet on the ship. And you see a lot of temperature fluctuation and a lot of somewhat of a humidity fluctuation as the product is trying to equilibrate, but it happens at the port. Once the product is loaded on the ship, as denoted by this this second red bar or second red line as designated as B, it starts to stabilize. And there's really kind of a buffering effect that is happening because of all the other containers that are around the container when it's on the ship. And so it's not subject to the direct sunlight conditions or temperature conditions which cause these fluctuations during the day. So it really does kind of stabilize. You do see some movement on humidity. Temperature remains relatively steady. And then as you get to the third vertical red line here, C, that's when it's actually offloaded from the ship. And again, you see this temperature fluctuation as it's sitting there in the port, ready to be picked up. So once it's on the water, really there's this buffering effect that happens, and you don't see a lot of movement on temperature. You see a little bit of movement on humidity. In this case, we did rise in humidity to 75% relative humidity, but this isn't really a concern. We have data that shows we can estimate what the moisture would be for 75% humidity and how long it would take to get there for a given temperature. And remember, the isotherm that I showed you previously showed that if you're less than really 80% relative humidity, you're going to be fine, even if it takes up all that moisture. But the fact of the matter is it doesn't take up moisture that quickly. And so this really isn't a concern that we did see some spikes in humidity up to 75% here. All right, this study right here, this is one of the recent ones that we did shipping the product to Japan. And again, you can see the first red vertical line here that reflects really when it arrived at the port. The second red vertical line reflects when it was loaded onto the ship. And it's that period in between those two lines where you see some temperature and humidity fluctuation. I should have pointed out here the temperature is the black line on this graph, and the humidity is the green line on the graph. And sorry, my scale on the right is hard to see, but the maximum humidity here on this scale is about 60% up here at the very top. And so in this study, really we're very stable on humidity, this green line all throughout, right about 45% relative humidity during shipping. When it was offloaded here in Japan, in Tokyo, at this third red bar or third red line, you start to see the temperature and humidity fluctuations. We did spike up to about 60%, but it didn't stay there very long. And so this again, confirmed that we don't see a lot of issues during shipping, and the maximum conditions that were reached here, in this case 61.9% relative humidity, it was only there for a little bit of time. But even if it had been held there the whole time, it wouldn't be a concern from a mold growth and aflatoxin development standpoint. So just to summarize on the transit studies, what we know and what has been confirmed through these multiple studies, temperature and humidity are relatively steady during ocean transit period. The fluctuations are really seen primarily at the ports. The observed conditions, they do not significantly impact moisture during transit. And they also ensure that the almonds maintain a low water activity during transit, a low enough water activity that is inhibitory towards mold growth and development of aflatoxin. So it's really, the studies do answer the question, what about shipping? Do we have to be concerned with aflatoxin during shipping? And all the studies that we've conducted to date have shown that no, we do not. And I'd also like to add that some of these studies have been done on other commodities as well, and we've compared results, and they're similar. You see this in peanuts, you see this in walnuts as well. Spikes in moisture or temperature, they do not result in elevated moisture or conditions conducive for the mold growth. So again, aflatoxin development during transit, this is a take-home message. It is not a concern. All right, so now I'm gonna switch a little bit about what is aflatoxin and how we control it to more on kind of the sampling for aflatoxin. And I think everyone can agree that with sampling for aflatoxin, the sellers really try hard to meet the buyer's expectations and the regulatory expectations, and so we're all trying to do the same thing. But oftentimes there are discrepancies between seller and regulatory or buyer aflatoxin levels. So we'll test the product here and we'll come up with one value. A regulatory agency may test it upon arrival at the port and come up with a different value. The customer may test it at that point and come up with a different value. And so that really begs the question as to why are we seeing all of this variability? Why are we seeing these discrepancies? The answer is variability. There are different sources of variability when you start sampling for aflatoxin. And variability is really kind of that lack of consistency or the likelihood of change. And we see that really the three sources that we deal with are the sampling variability. So variability caused from how you physically pull that sample, how many samples you pull, when you pull those samples, is it representative of the lot, the size of that sample? All of that will impact sampling variability. Sample preparation variability. So once you have that sample, how are you preparing it? Are you grinding up the whole sample? Are you pulling aliquots and then grinding those samples up? Has it been mixed uniformly? That can impact the variability that's seen as well. And then you get into the analytical variability. So once you have a ground sample, how much of that sample are you actually preparing for analysis, and how are you conducting that analysis? That can contribute to the variability as well. And so when we're looking at sampling, this is where we do find that the most variability exists. It's really around how you sample for the product. And the goal here is to make sure that you're pulling a sample that is representative of the lot. But when you have a 44,000 pound lot or 20,000 kilogram lot, but you're only pulling a small sample size, this example here is 10 kilogram. When we get into Epec, we'll talk about the sample size we pull, which is 20 kilogram. But really the challenge is how does that small sample really accurately reflect a large lot? And how can you be assured that with that small sample you're going to meet the regulatory limits? And you can do your best, but at the end of the day, it really relates to how you're pulling that sample and the size of the sample that you're pulling, and you can still see some variability, and I'll talk a little bit about that. So with aflatoxin, what we see in almonds is that it's really kind of like what you see here on the left. It's non-homogeneous. It's not mixed uniformly within a lot. So it's not like we have this perfectly distributed level of aflatoxin throughout the lot. If so, we could pull a very small sample, test that small sample, and be assured that that sample represents the lot entirely. It's just not the case. It's not the case with microorganisms as well. But with aflatoxin, we see that it's even kind of less homogeneous. We don't have a huge issue with aflatoxin in almonds. It's hard to find aflatoxin in almonds, and when you do find it, it's not homogeneous. It's not like what you see here on the right, where each of these little white spheres represents nice uniform distribution within the lot. You're going to find potentially hot pockets. You can find just a few nuts that potentially contribute to a level of aflatoxin in a sample, and so this creates some challenges. The size of the sample, that's really important in trying to address this distribution, this non-homogeneous distribution, and making sure that you're pulling samples that are incremental across the lot. And I'll show that here in a second. But if you're just pulling a 10 kilogram sample from a tote or two, that's not going to represent what you're going to find across the lot. If you pull a smaller sample size and you find aflatoxin, it may actually give you an overestimation on the concentration because of the smaller sample size. So all of this kind of plays into this variability that's associated with sampling. We've done a number of different studies, both in almonds, and then there's been other studies that have been done in other crops, and I got a couple slides I'll show you on that as well. But what you see here is an almond study in which there were 16 different samples taken, 10 kilogram samples from a lot, from one lot. So 10 kilograms was pulled 16 different times from a lot. And you can see the representation of aflatoxin from those analyses. It ranged from 0 in a couple of cases, all the way up to, in one of the samples that was analyzed, 199 part per billion. So quite a wide spread, and a mean of 22.1 part per billion. So this really does illustrate kind of that variability that can be attributed to sampling. How do you get around this? Well, if you start to take a larger sample size, you'll reduce the variability. If you start to take more incremental samples throughout the lot, you'll start to reduce that variability, and hopefully you'll end up with a range that is tighter, around that mean. It's not a problem that's unique to almonds. This shows it here in peanuts as well. In this study, you had a number of different samples that was pulled from a peanut lot. These were 5 kilogram samples, and you had results, again, ranging all the way down from non-detectable, so 0, all the way up to 69 part per billion, with a mean of 18.8. And again, with pistachios, a similar type of thing, from 16 samples that were pulled, 10 kilogram samples, a low of 0 part per billion, all the way up to 64 with a mean of 8.5. So not a problem unique to almonds. Sampling variability is huge in these nuts, particularly given the low levels of aflatoxin. Your sampling has to be very robust to try to reduce the variability that's seen. So as I just alluded to, how do you really minimize the sampling variability? You do need a robust sampling plan and a large sample size. And so what I've done here is I'm just showing you here graphically what our PEC protocol calls for sampling. Under the PEC program, you have to have 22 incremental samples. Those are pulled into a 20 kilogram total sample, so a very large sample size, a 44-pound sample. And those 22 incremental samples typically are made up of smaller samples, actually, that are taken incrementally throughout the lot. And this is done either manually. You've got a photo here of a probe with multi-ports that you can pull incremental samples from each tote. Or a lot of folks will pull samples in line as they're processing that product at defined intervals. Maybe every few minutes they're pulling a sample that is then pooled into this 910 kilogram sample. They have 22 of those that they gather throughout the run, and then that sample is further mixed and divided and ground and then analyzed. So to really get at the sampling variability, you need to have a robust sampling plan that makes sure that you're pulling incrementally throughout the lot. Now, the bigger the sample size, the better, but it has to be within reason. I mean, there's a lot of dollar costs associated with sampling a large volume of product. If you pull the 200-pound sample, you're going to reduce that variability, but that's a lot of money that you're wasting on that product. The product's destroyed, it's analyzed, so you can't recoup that. So it has to make sense. And we believe that our program with the 22 incremental samples, 20 kilogram size, gives us the best assurance that we can accurately measure the level of aflatoxin. But there is still some variability even with this plan. Now, as we get into the other two areas of variability, it's really around how that sample is prepared and then the analytical procedures as well. And so what we find is that with the sample preparation, it's really important that it's mixed properly and then it's ground properly to a uniform size so that aflatoxin can be appropriately extracted and analyzed for. And so this still is a source of variability, that sample prep, not as much as the sampling itself, but it still does contribute, and it's something that needs to be paid attention to. The analysis side, interesting enough, as you're starting to analyze that product, we see less variability associated with the analysis. The labs are very adept at testing for aflatoxin. The procedures are well defined, methodologies are well defined, and there's a lot of checks and verification activities to ensure the laboratories are capable. So we see far less variation associated with analysis, at least here in the U.S. laboratories. that accreditation needs to be there in laboratories that are testing for this in other parts of the world. And so there can be some variability associated with analysis if you're not accredited. We look at it in its entirety. So as I mentioned, you saw this slide previously, we've got the sampling variability, sample prep variability, and the analytical variability. What we find is that 96.4% of the variability really is associated around that sampling. If you're not sampling appropriately, you can actually have a lot of variability. The sample preparation, that constitutes far less. 3.4% of the variability is attributed to sample prep. Still significant, but far less than the sampling contribution. And then the analytical variability, as I mentioned, that contributes far less than the previous two at only 0.2%. All right, now one other thing that I just want to mention is when you're talking about sampling for aflatoxin and actually developing a program to set some limits around what you're testing for. We have some tools that we can start to analyze that help to guide our decision making around what we're seeing. And this chart is a little bit busy. I apologize for it, but I just wanted to point out a couple of things on this. On the left axis here, you can see lots rejected in the EU on a percentage basis. The bottom x-axis is lots rejected in the US on a percentage basis. And then on the very top, this very top line on the graph here, and you can see I've circled the accept reject criteria in green, less than 8B1 or less than 10 total part per billion. That's the accept reject limit for the EU. And that's also what we use for our program under PEC. Anything that meets that limit, so less than 8 part per billion B1 or less than 10 total, is accepted here, and we'll issue a PEC certificate. And Bryce will get into that here in a couple of minutes. And then the sample size here is based on two 10-kilogram samples, so that 20-kilogram sample pulled from those 22 incremental samples that I just mentioned. The red bar here, I've circled these dots across the different lines on this graph. That represents a theoretical aflatoxin limit or level in the crop of 3 part per billion. So the red circled dots here. What you can see on the right here, for each, and then the lines represent each of the accept reject criteria. So again, the one I circled is the 8B1 10 total, and then the next one is the 8 less than 8 total, less than 6 total, less than 4, less than 2, and then less than 0.5. And what you see here is that each one of these lines, as you start to tighten up the accept reject criteria, so in the first case, moving from 8B1 10 total to 8, you actually shift the curve a little bit to the right. And you can see what happens there. You'll end up rejecting more product in the US, so you'll hold back more product. And what that means is if that product is tested in the EU, you would expect a reduced level of rejection in the EU. And that is indeed what happens. It's called seller's risk and buyer's risk. By doing that, by setting a tighter tolerance, you end up rejecting more product here in the US and thereby reducing less product in the EU. Now, the challenge with that is you also end up rejecting more good product. So again, because of the non-homogeneous distribution of aflatoxin in the lot, even if you get a level that shows you that you've exceeded one of these accept reject criterias, if you were to sample again, you might find that it was less than that initially. You'll end up holding more good product back by doing that, by setting a tighter tolerance. But it's important that we understand that this is here. We can use these curves to help kind of guide us based on what we're seeing in the actual crop. And if we start to see issues with increased rejections in the EU, individual companies, if they start to see increased rejections, they can actually set their own internal accept reject criteria and start to hold back more product. As an organization, as the Almond Board, we can do that as well. If the board chooses to tighten up on the accept reject criteria because we have higher levels of aflatoxin in the product, we can actually hold more of that product back here and ship fewer higher loads to the EU. So it's an important tool. It's something we analyze from time to time. We're looking at the level of aflatoxin in the crop every year, and then we make some determinations if we need to do anything. So again, I just wanted to point out that this is a very useful tool that the industry does indeed use. So just to really kind of sum up, how we're addressing aflatoxin. We really, we're looking at it from the orchard level all the way through to some of the final sampling and testing that we're doing, sorting in between. But the one thing I wanted to point out is, aflatoxin levels, they are going to vary by crop year. It's not always going to be, at a constant level. The good thing is in almonds, we never see really high levels of aflatoxin, but it does fluctuate from year to year. And we do see that it correlates with insect damage. So there's a lot that we know that we can do to help to keep those levels in check, and we do indeed do that with good sanitation practices in the orchard. But again, there's a large level of variability in what you see. You'll see variability from year to year. You'll even see variability across the regions of the state. And to help us address that, really robust sampling plans are important. And I just wanted to illustrate here this little chart on the right really does show what the effect of random variability is on retested consignments and also the non-homogeneity of the aflatoxin in the lot. You can see for different levels of aflatoxin, if we're rejecting here in the US at the origin at a certain percentage, we still do expect to see, if they test in the EU, we expect to see a certain number of rejections in the EU. You can't 100% eliminate that risk. We can do a lot here to hold back bad lots. We do so at the expense of actually holding back good lots as well. But we're never going to 100% reduce that risk, and that's why you will still see rejections in the EU. And of course, as the aflatoxin levels go up here, we're going to reject more levels here, but you're also going to still see expected levels in the EU. So that is all I had on kind of understanding where aflatoxin is coming from and how to sample for it. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Bryce, and Bryce is going to walk us through that final step on the pre-export check program for testing for product before it's shipped to the EU. So Bryce, it's all yours.
Great. Well, thanks, Tim. Appreciate that setup, and good morning to you all. Thanks for joining us today for our Trading Tuesday talk here. Tim's right. I'm going to walk us through what we call our pre-export checks program, acronym PEC. We have a number of acronyms in this industry, and there'll be some in my presentation. So hopefully I'll explain those as we go through here. Pre-export checks program. I think it's helpful to kind of walk through how we arrived where we are today. And what you see on your screen in front of you here is a little bit about the title of the slide here, From Challenge to Opportunity, a little bit about the history of aflatoxin, specifically the history of aflatoxin and our shipments to Europe. Europe, as Tim showed earlier on one of the slides, is a really important export destination or export region for us for our almond shipments. And you can see it's actually pretty mature. It's a place we've been shipping almonds from California for a number of years. And if we go back in the history of aflatoxin going into Europe, if you look in the 2006-07, as it shows here, we started to see increased rejections for aflatoxin in Europe for California almond shipments there, to the point to where the EU sent over, conducted a Food Veterinary Office or FVO audit. Almonds were actually for a period of time placed on safeguard measures, which increased the level of control for almonds arriving. So increased the level of testing upon arrival in the EU for almonds from California. Through that program, or through that time, we worked towards a system called VASP. The acronym VASP stands for Voluntary Aflatoxin Sampling Plan. And in a lot of ways, that is kind of the predecessor program to the pre-export checks program. So VASP was instituted there, and really for a number of years, as you can see here, the efforts were quite effective. The amount of controls were reduced in Europe, which is helpful for our exporters here. It's obviously very helpful to have lower levels of controls when you arrive there. We were removed, we came off of safeguard measures. We saw the amount of rejections for aflatoxin come down during that period. So much to the fact that in between 2012 and 14, we were allowed to work towards what they call it an Article 23 request. So it was kind of asking for permission to work towards the pre-export checks program. Pre-export checks is a regulation they have in Europe for not just almond, for essentially any commodities that meet the requirements for applying for that type of a program. There's just a very few number of commodities that do it. Actually, we may be, if not, there may be Canadian wheat, I believe, but I think we're the only U.S. commodity right now that is eligible for pre-export checks. So in a lot of ways, that was the EU recognizing the controls that the almond industry had put in place for aflatoxin and rewarding them with a program like this. And really what the pre-export checks program does is allows consignments or shipments from California, of California almonds into Europe with a valid pre-export checks documents. And I'll touch on this in some later slides. With that setup, you can have less than 1% controls, or less than 1% of consignments that arrive in Europe will be tested upon arrival. And that's important for a lot of reasons. As you saw earlier in Tim's presentation, with aflatoxin not being homogeneous in the lot, you can imagine the more testing you do, there is the potential always for finding one of those little not hot spots, but aggregations of aflatoxin in the lot that may not have been found in a previous test. And so to the under 1% import control is a big deal for the industry. It facilitates the trade in a great way. In that 2015 is when pre-export checks went into effect. And then we came into the 2017-18 crop, which many of you on the call may remember had an elevated level of insect damage. That year we had, I believe it was 2.4% inedible percentage coming in from the field. And as Tim touched on earlier, we know insect damage correlates with aflatoxin. And so we started to see more rejections. And I've got a slide on this later in Europe for aflatoxin. There was a time where Tim was just showing a slide about where he had the blue slide. There's a lot of different lines there, the OC curves. We were actually able, or the board decided to tighten the tolerance. So the 8 parts per billion B1, which B1 is a type of aflatoxin, and 10 parts per billion total aflatoxin, which is the limits in Europe, we actually cut that limit by half and made the accept reject criteria. So what constitutes a passing PEC result or not, we take that down to 5% in the hopes that we could kind of, it's almost like a rudder, make reject more here so that when it would be tested in Europe, we wouldn't see as many rejections there. And it was actually quite effective. We worked through that year. We came out in the next year, the insect damage was down, the inedible content was down. So we were able to return back to the 8 and 10 accept reject criteria, which is where we stay today. But let's jump in a little bit about the pre-export checks program. As I mentioned earlier, it was implemented on August 1st of 2015. That's the start of our 2015-16 crop year. So we're 7 years in here. As far as the entities that are involved here, USDA is recognized as essential competent authority. Almond Board is what's considered a local competent authority. We do things like training for our PEC participants. So the handlers that participate in this program, we do the training for that. We conduct the on-site verifications. And then we have a CDFA, or shipping point inspection, actually initials or signs the documents, which makes the 3-page documents you see on the right of the screen here, makes them valid. So the leftmost slide there, picture, is what we call our aflatoxin analysis page. And that's the labs will input all this information into our EPEC system. They'll do all those testing that Tim was referencing earlier. And if the result is under the limit, under the accept reject criteria, it would get a passing result. The handler completes the other 2 pages, and then the inspector signs them, and they become an official pre-export checks document. And it's that document that goes with the consignment to Europe and lowers the level of import control, so under that 1% here. And as you can see, PEC is recognized program by the European Commission. It's not mandatory, however. So we do see that most consignments that go to Europe are covered by pre-export checks program. And that's, again, it helps facilitate ease of import into the EU for consignments arriving without a valid PEC. The port officials can decide at what frequency they would like to control. So at what frequency they'd like to sample. They could, in theory, test every consignment that would arrive without a valid PEC. It would be up to the discretion of the port officials. As it says here, we have a manual. It's quite detailed manual that our PEC participants, or our handlers that participate in this program. Each year, handlers sign what we call an MOU, or a Memorandum of Understanding. They're agreeing to a number of different things you see here. Sampling protocols, which Tim did a great job of touching on. That's really the bedrock of this program. Hygiene programs, fail lot controls. What do you do if you have a PEC that actually doesn't pass? What are the rework options there? What do you do in that instance? We cover that in detail in our MOU and in our training and our verifications as well. And we also touch, as you can see here, the use of USDA Approved Laboratories, which are performing the analysis of these samples that are drawn by the handlers. Tim touched on sampling quite a bit, so I won't spend a lot of time here. But as Tim alluded to in his presentation, the sample is really vital because of the non-homogeneous nature of aflatoxin in almonds. You can see based on the lot size that's being shipped to Europe, will determine what the aggregate sample size, so the total sample weight, and then what the number of required incremental samples, or how many small samples are required minimum to meet that large sample. For most of the consignments going to Europe, they're going to be over that 22,046 pounds. So most samples are going to have a minimum of 22 increments. So 22 smaller samples that make up the 44-pound sample aggregate. And that's a pretty good size sample. For a lot of other analysis, you're going to see sample sizes that are smaller than that. But again, it's a good level of sample size for us to not sample too much product, but also try to get at that non-homogeneous nature of almonds, or of aflatoxin in almonds. In the program, so what happens is, and I've got this will make more sense on a slide to come, I think my next slide, but we utilize USDA approved laboratories to actually perform the analysis. And so I think I'll be able to touch on this better on this slide here. This is essentially like a flow chart of what happens in the PEC program. First and vitally is the sampling, right? The sampling happens at the handling facility typically. As Tim mentioned, it would typically happen either in line where you're taking samples as the product is being packed, or in some cases, it will be probed by a bin probe when it's in a finished packed form. Once that sample is drawn, and I should say too, there's a lot of documentation around the sampling as well, and I won't get into all those details today, but a lot of documentation that we verified through our audits and verification activities that we perform each year. That sample makes it to the lab. It's again one of those USDA approved labs. I think last time I checked, there's between 10 and 15 of these labs in up and down California that participate in the program. They're audited by USDA regularly, and we utilize them for their analysis services here under the PEC program. Now, obviously, after the lab, it either passes or it fails. We'll touch on right now what happens if it fails. So again, right now, the accept reject criteria is at 8 parts per billion B1, 10 parts per billion total. If product does get tested and it's above those levels, either the subsample, so the 44 pounds of samples split into 2 subsamples and analyzed separately. Both of the subsamples have to meet that 8 and 10 limit that I talked about earlier. If either of them don't, or if both of them don't, that product would be failed. The Epec, or our online system, would not allow that certificate to be generated. The results are inputted into that system via the laboratories. The handler has a couple options at that point. You can either find another destination for it where the analysis results are under the limits for the country that you're trying to ship to, or you would have to rework the product. That means resorting. So we know sorting is how you can reduce the level of insect damage, which is where we see a lot of the aflatoxin correlating. So you would actually have to do that, create a new lot number and start the process over. Or let's go back now. So that's what we talked about when we talk about failed lot, and there's a number of documentation that goes along with that. When we talk about a passing lot, now that the handler has a passing lot from the lab, that certificate is ready to be issued. Now, when the consignment actually ships out from the handler's facility, that's when you would start what we call the PEC Part 1 and 2, or the annex documents. That has a lot of the information on who's going to be buying the product in Europe, the container number, the departure date, all that kind of stuff. Once that's complete and provided to those inspectors, the shipping point inspectors, it would be issued. Or actually, first what they do is they check to make sure it meets the minimum quality standards. For the pre-export checks program, you cannot ship product that's over 5% serious defects, which would include that insect damage, or it can't also exceed 0.2% foreign material. If both of those, and that I should say that's for brown skin product, for non-manufactured product. Now, if that minimum quality standard is met, the inspector would then issue or sign those documents at that point. It's those documents then that would have to accompany the load and be provided upon import when the product gets to Europe. And I should say too, as you're listening here, if you might be wondering, well, if perhaps if you're a grower on the call here and say, why is this important? And I think the one thing that we want to stress is, it's important because Europe is an important market for our almonds. A lot of our almonds go to Europe. There a number of the pollinators. California or Europe is a big market for what we call our blanchable standards market. They do a lot of blanching and further manufacturing in Europe, and so. They also have the strictest limits for aflatoxin in the world, even stricter than here in the U.S. And so, this is a program that helps facilitate trade to an important market for a big segment of what we grow, and this is a way to really facilitate that. So the industry's really found a lot of value in this pre-export checks program over the last 7 years. One thing I also want to talk on in the next few slides would be about just some of that data coming out of the Epec system, that online system. We track this on a monthly basis. So you can see here, this is a printout from all of our lots tested from all the handlers that have submitted on a monthly basis for the 2021 crop, so the crop that was harvested last fall. As staff, we monitor this data. We inform our Almond Quality Food Safety and Services, or AQFSS committee, each fall. And then if the numbers start to look like they're getting to a place where it makes the committee uncomfortable, they can actually suggest a change to that accept reject criteria to the board of directors. And if the board of directors decides, that can actually be changed. And as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, after the 17-18 crop year, we saw an increased level of rejections in Europe, and the board actually decided to cut that accept reject criteria in half. So effectively what that did is have more consignments rejected here and have to be reworked here, so that in the hopes of that there'd be less rejections by the time it got to Europe. Here you can see a graph. This will actually show what I just articulated very well. You can see the orange line plotted on the right-hand side is the failure rate. So you can see the failure rate increased in 2017. That is a factor of two things. One, higher levels of insect damage or serious damage. You can see 2.4% here, which is a 10-year high in the 17 crop. But also when that accept reject criteria was cut in half down to 5 parts per billion, essentially it's like a rudder. We were rejecting more lots here in Europe here in California, in the hopes that they wouldn't be rejected when they arrived in Europe. And so what we saw is that failure rate come down, certainly as the next year's crop came in a little cleaner, and that crop, the 17 crop, kind of worked through the system. And then as you see in the upper right-hand side here, the limits were actually returned back to the normal 8 parts per billion B1, 10 total in September of 2019. So I think that accurately depicts kind of how the system can kind of help to control the product base that's coming in from an aflatoxin pressure standpoint, and still facilitate trade throughout that whole period of time. If you look here, this is just plotting on the left-hand side, the average aflatoxin. You can see for the failed lot, I should say, that's in the blue columns here. You can see on the whole, over the last 7 years, the average aflatoxin in the failed stream is similar. What has changed is the serious damage. So in theory, potentially the amount of aflatoxin that's coming in from the field, that's plotted in that, I'll call it a orangish color. I don't know, I'm not always good at my colors, but the upper line there, you can see how I mentioned earlier that 2.4% in 2017. We actually saw on this last year's crop, the 2021 crop, return to just under 2%. So that's a little elevated from the last few years where we've been decreasing after the 2017 crop. So we've been monitoring that Epec data closely to make sure that things are still tracking in a good direction there. If you look here on the average aflatoxin in all lots, we did see a slight increase, and this is the yellow line here in the middle of the page. Slight increase this year in the average aflatoxin, all lots tested, but not certainly to the level that we saw in the 17 crop, where we started to see a number of those rejections. And then on the accept lot stream, that's held pretty consistent. I mean, you can see it's a pretty narrow band there. Essentially from 2017 to now, you're between 0.35 and 0.4 parts per billion total on the accept reject, on the accept stream there. So this is all things we monitor and make recommendation or present to our Almond Quality and Food Safety Committee. So let's talk about rejections in Europe. Here's a graph that a colleague prepared, and this articulates well why we had to make those changes in the 17-18 crop year. This graph plots the number of rejections in Europe by the European group by calendar year, though. So even though 2018 is where we see a 32 rejections, that would be the calendar year of 2018, which is predominantly when most of the 2017-18 crop would have been shipped. And so we typically, that's where we had to make those adjustments to essentially try to reject more consignments here in the US, and so that we could start to cut down on some of these rejections in the EU. And you can see it's worked pretty well. And actually, since then, it's been reducing. I don't have 22 plotted on here. I think I saw a colleague, Avi, on the line. Maybe he could post it in the chat if it's important. But we do see kind of a decreasing level after that 17-18 crop, where we had a higher level of aflatoxin in the crop. Some common questions, and I'm getting closer to our wrapping up here. So if you have some questions, be thinking of those, and you can post them in the chat or let Taylor know and be happy to answer them. But, some things that I thought we'd cover off on here is sometimes what we'll hear from handlers is that there'll be certain port authorities in Europe that will request or make the pre-export checks documents mandatory. As I mentioned earlier, this is a voluntary program. So it's actually not, it's not allowed for European Union port officials to reject a consignment or a shipment just for the fact that they didn't have a PEC. Now, they could choose to test it upon arrival. And if the test would be, if they tested and the results are above the 8 and 10 limits that they have for the European Union, then they could reject the consignment. And actually, now we have more options for reconditioning or reworking in Europe. There's some approved processors in Europe that can do some blanching to reduce those level of aflatoxin and actually not have to ship the product all the way back to the U.S. now, which is really beneficial. The other thing we see come from time to time is that there's countries that are not a part of the European Union that will that handlers will try to get a PEC for, and really, as it says here, non-EU countries may adopt or recognize EU regulations and programs, but it's not automatic. So, as far as countries that are not in the EU that accept PEC currently, Norway, Iceland, and the UK would have adopted those regulations, but someone like Switzerland has not. So, consignments that are destined for non-EU countries or non-EU plus Norway plus Iceland plus UK, if it's not one of those countries, we actually would, there's not a pre-export checks documents that can be obtained for that destination. And then lastly, sometimes you'll see this from time to time as I mentioned, those valid, it's the wet signature that's on the PEC document that makes that document valid. And it's actually that physical document that has to be presented in Europe. And so what we'll see sometimes is that whoever's handling the paperwork or it might be lost in transit. And what happens in those situations, what we do is we have a copy of the original provided, but there's not a replacement original that can be provided in those instances. And so anyway, we typically advise our handlers to send over a letter referencing whoever their mail carrier has a claim number for that lost package. And typically that's handled on a kind of case-by-case basis, but we've seen that resolved successfully a number of times. It does happen from time to time. Okay, so I know I went through that fairly fast, but I thought what I'd try to do here is kind of wrap up some key takeaways from what we've covered today. And certainly if you have some questions, we'd love to hear from you. As Tim mentioned, aflatoxin comes from the Aspergillus fungi present in the environment. It's measured in parts per billion, so it's pretty low. Tim used the analogy of 1 part per billion being like a drop in an Olympic-sized pool. So pretty small levels, but it's still an important thing that we track, and there's limits for it in Europe as there are all over the world. It correlates with insect damage. So certainly if you're a grower listening to us today, we appreciate all your efforts that you do in the field every day to control your insect populations, your navel orangeworm, your winter sanitation that you do. That really pays off in a number of ways, and one of those ways being lower levels of aflatoxin, which helps open up your almonds to be able to go to more markets all over the world, which is really a good thing for everyone involved. The pre-export checks program is in place to ensure that proper sampling and analysis happens, and it kind of helps to facilitate ease of trade and aflatoxin controls. The average level of aflatoxin in all lots tested is below the level we saw in 2017. The 2021 crop, as you saw earlier, is about one part per billion on average, all lots tested, which is fairly steady with what we saw in 2019 and 2020, the 2 crop years preceding this last one. And then the average level of aflatoxin in the exception lots, and I mentioned this earlier, is just under 0.4 parts per billion total, which is that was that lower line on that graph we looked at earlier. It's been pretty consistent or steady over the last 4 to 5 crop years. And then lastly, I'll just say, Epec is effectively screening and removing higher level of aflatoxin lots prior to shipping. We've seen fewer rejections in Europe. Remember that graph back in 2018 with the 2017-18 crop where we saw over 30 rejections. That's down significantly with only 6 in 2021. And so again, the efforts from all involved in the industry are much appreciated. So with that, I thought what I'd do, I don't know if Taylor's on the line. If we have any questions, I think if you direct them to Tim or I, we'd be happy to answer them. Thanks for your attention today.
Thanks, Tim and Bryce. Yeah, we do have a few questions. Patrick asked how many EU rejections have happened so far in 2022, and we have our Global Trade and Regulatory Affairs member, Abhijit Kulkarni, on. He answered that there have been no official rejections so far in the EU. We also have Thamus on with us today, and he asked Bryce, what's the criterion, what is used to resort or destroy the rejected lot in the Netherlands?
Yeah. So in the Netherlands, there's and Abby, feel free to add in here if you want to post something in the chat, but there's a processor that does blanching. And so if you have a load that gets rejected in Europe for high aflatoxin, in the past, that would have had to been shipped back to the US and then potentially resorted here and then re-exported. Now there are some approved blanchers in Europe that can actually blanch the product. So as Tim mentioned earlier, when you blanch almonds, just by physically removing the skin and kind of some of the denaturization there, you see a reduced levels of aflatoxin. So as far as I'm aware, I believe the one in the Netherlands is a blancher, but the important part is they're set up with the European Commission to be able to rework product that is tested above limits when it arrives. So it's a good option for those consignments that do have a rejection in Europe. But thank you, Abby, for posting that. It's great to hear that we don't have any so far for the 2022 calendar year. That's great to hear.
Mark Carlson also asked a question, I think many others on the call might wonder too, is do countries of the East use PEC, India, Pakistan? And Abby answered that as well and said only PEC is only accepted in the EU.
Yep. Yeah, and a number of countries around the world have limits for aflatoxin upon arrival. But as far as the pre-export checks program, it's specifically in the European Union's regulations. So kind of like, it's written into the regulations. So it's a program specifically for the European Union. For other destinations where handlers ship there, they may be testing, taking another sample, testing for aflatoxin, but it wouldn't follow this whole program. It wouldn't have a certificate that would essentially accompany the consignment as it arrives at those other destinations.
Frank asked, and I apologize if I say this wrong, Frank asked that coning and quartering is a sampling protocol that's been used in the mineral ore business for many years. Have there ever been a comparison made of these approaches?
Yeah, so I have to confess, I'm not familiar with the coning and sampling method that he referenced there, but I can tell you that our sampling program was developed with Dr. Tom Whitaker, USDA ARS, really looking at how do we pull the best sample that is reasonable. So we spent a lot of effort, really looking at the sample size and the number of incremental samples. And then the other consideration is how do we mirror what the EU is doing as well. And so we had to take that into consideration. So we feel confident in our sampling and think that it's a robust sample.
Bryce, Thamus asked a follow-up. He asked what chemicals, if they're used for blanching.
Tim, I mean, as far as I'm aware, it's just a hot water kind of blanching setup. Are you familiar with the reconditioner in the Netherlands and what types of exact processes they're using there, Tim? I believe it's just typical blanching. So
just typical blanching. So no chemicals. It's a hot water blanch. Exposure to basically a tube that contains hot water, and the almonds are pulled through on a conveyor or a chain, and the skins are removed.
And I'll add to that too. That's for the reconditioning in Europe. But when we have a failed lot here in California, the reconditioning kind of plan, I guess, if you want to call it that, is, as Tim had mentioned earlier, we know that most of the aflatoxin is correlated with insect damage. So what we would look for the handler to supply records to show us is that the product was reworked. And when it reworked, it's lower the level of serious damage or insect damage in that consignment. So if it was 1.5% serious damage or insect damage for a consignment when it failed, we'd look for that to be reduced prior to retesting to essentially hopefully lower the aflatoxin pressure in that consignment before retesting. Hopefully that helps as well. So.
Thamus said thank you to both of you guys, and thank you, Thamus, for joining us today. We always appreciate having you on. Mark Carlson asked, what do they use for protocols in India and Pakistan?
Yeah, good question. Probably Avi from GTRA might be able to help more here, but there's not the testing levels on other countries. Maybe they're all different, right? And so they may not be quite as developed, perhaps, on the testing levels. I don't know how frequently almonds imported into India are tested. Now in Japan, I think this question also mentioned Japan. I know Tim's done a lot of work in there. I'll let him add some comments here, but we do see currently, I believe, 100% of our consignments arriving in Japan are tested for aflatoxin. And they kind of test aflatoxin, they sample for aflatoxin testing in a little bit different way. Tim, I don't know if you want to touch on that a little bit, but we do see pretty widespread testing for aflatoxin for shipments to Japan.
Yeah, it seems like countries like India and Pakistan aren't as concerned with testing for aflatoxin, at least not to the same levels that we see in Europe. And then, like Bryce just mentioned, Japan. In Japan, it's under 100% controls. So every single lot that is imported into Japan is indeed tested. And their sampling plan is a little bit different. They pull 5 kilogram samples. Actually, they're 2.5 kilogram samples times 2, and then they do that 3 times. And we think that contributes to some of the levels that we see. We don't necessarily believe that the sampling is equivalent to what our PEC protocol calls for. So we're working on that, and hopefully at some point we'll be able to get better aligned with the sampling there. But it's a problem with Japan because we ship such high quality product. 100% of the consignments are tested, they're sampled. We know the non-homogeneous distribution creates some challenges when you find it. That smaller sample size, it may actually result in a overestimation of the level of aflatoxin because of the lack of dilution factor that's happening. But it's something that we're aware of, and we continue to work on.
Abby noted that India and Pakistan currently do not have any protocol related to aflatoxin testing currently.
Thanks, Abby.
Igor asked, and this may be something we can take offline if we need to, but who are the approved blanchers in the European Union?
Yeah, we can provide that to you. I think, to my knowledge, I know there's one in the Netherlands. I think there might have been one that was approved in Spain, but we can certainly, if that's of interest, reach out to some of our folks in Global Trade and Regulatory Affairs, and we can provide that to you. No problem.
As you were answering that, Abby sent him his email. So
perfect. Okay, great.
Okay, that looks like all of the questions. Last call for any questions. If anybody has anything to ask before we wrap up here. Any last thoughts, Tim or Bryce?
Now, just want to thank everyone for joining us this morning. I know it's probably not the most exciting topic, for us to start our day with aflatoxin. We love this stuff, but we love coming up with solutions for it. We don't necessarily love aflatoxin, but I do appreciate you all joining us here today to hear a little bit about our program.
Yeah, and I would just say, again, thanks again for joining us today, and thank you for all your efforts, whether you're in the field, growing the crop, or in some other step in the value chain. Everybody's efforts to help control insect damage and aflatoxin as a result of that are really appreciated, and helps us to just facilitate that trade and move this product all over the world. As Tim mentioned earlier, over 70% of our product goes overseas, and Europe is a big part of that. So thanks to all of you for your efforts to make that happen.
And thanks everyone for joining us today. Training Tuesdays are back. This was Training Tuesday 6. We have Training Tuesdays every first and third Tuesday of the month, and I think we're actually adding a few in the upcoming months to that schedule as well. You can visit almonds.com/events for more information and to see future dates on Training Tuesdays. The next Training Tuesday will be May 17th. again in this realm with managing warehouse pests. A lot of discussion on mating disruption and what to do in that arena. So stay with us and keep an eye out for some information coming out on the next Training Tuesday, Part 7 on managing warehouse pests. Thanks again and have a good week.